this opportunity to talk to you. It's a real privilege, and to share with you, with Carolyn, some of our experience in terms of working with organizations to look at learning and development. And we really have asked a number of questions about the impact and the added value of leadership development. We've been working with lots of organizations, and over the years had lots of experience and run some really exciting programs. And about 10 years ago, I developed cancer, for which I'm now completely cured. But with a sort of experience like that, it begins to ask, what are you doing and why you're doing it? And in terms of learning and development and leadership development, I asked myself, am I really making the difference to the world that I think I'm making? So I contacted all the people who've been on my programs and asked them, how did you find the experience and what have you done with it? And very few of them could actually tell me how they'd impacted on their organizations. So we looked around for something that actually could show that people had impact. And both Carolyn and I come from the same value base that it's nice developing programs, it's nice giving people experience, but in the end, it's actually what they do with it and how they have impact on their organizations that's important. And what we found was a lot of people and a lot of organizations spend a lot of money on designing and delivering absolutely superb development programs. The problem is we haven't been managing the impact of those programs and often rely on what we call pioneers, individual pioneers who are given the authority to change their organization. The problem with pioneers is you can often see them face down in the gutter with arrows in their back. And we wanted a more systematic way of making sure that when we did run programs and organizations did invest large amounts of money, that we actually added value and made sure people became self-empowered achievers as well as individual pioneers. Carolyn, do you want to add something to that?
For me, it was a very similar kind of journey in that I had been working for 10 years with a leading telecom company, and we'd we'd taken all of their senior managers and leaders through a fabulous program, one of the best I think I've ever worked on, where we included the CEO and vice presidents from that company in every single meeting as business coaches, as well as our organizational development coaches who were giving feedback. And what you saw at the end was that a lot of these people actually left the organization, so they failed to actually stay in the organization. And I think ethically that started to be a bit of a big question for me, because it was the company that was employing us to help them deliver business results. And what we were doing were creating these very motivated pioneers where, yes, there had been a shift in the individual, but not much impact on the organization.
Yeah, and what we'd like to do is share with you some of that experience. So if I can move you on to, Carolyn, to slide 3.
Yeah, I can't actually go down. That's a bit my problem. Ali, I don't know. I don't seem to have control of moving slides.
I think you have paused it. Yeah, can you click it on the window that you're displaying on your computer, and then click it forward? There you go.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, it's working fine now.
Okay. In our experience, many companies are taking people through a process, a journey of change, from business now to business in the future. And leadership, in our experience now, has a context. It's not one model that fits all any longer. And if you look at the different levels and what they specifically need to deliver the business, it's often very different things. And that's why it's become so complex and so variable, that in a volatile uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, one of the things is often the pace of change. And some organizations go through transformational change, which is sometimes a complete revolution from what they're doing now. Some organizations go through a step-by-stage change, which is a transactional process. But it's often harnessing the perception and alignment of people at every single level in the business that starts that business moving towards that future and that possible future. And it's that alignment process, that alignment to people and the business that we'll be engaging on, and giving you some tips from the research that we've conducted, the systems that we've developed, that enable you to fill that knowing-doing gap that is about connecting and engaging and getting people committed and making a difference to the business that they're working in. Okay, next slide, Carolyn, please. This is a simple model that we've used to begin to explain some of the perceptual differences. It's not purist. There are elements of behaviors in each one of them. But a lot of organizations, and I've done a lot of work with different cultures, and some of this is cultural bound as well. The first model that we come up with is where an organization has a perception of competition externally and competition internally. And traditionally, that's an organization where yesterday is the same as today, is the same as tomorrow, where often the added value is leadership and genius in the boardroom. And what that tends to create is hierarchical, functional systems where people are vying for positions. The issue then is getting strategy implemented, and it's often command and control with a quasi-legalistic HR function where it's compliance that's required. The second model is one about competition externally and collaboration internally. This is where you're looking, it's still a battle in the marketplace, but you need the hearts and minds of people, where innovation is required, and to do what you need to do requires focus and creativity. And this is where that customer focus provides you with the ability of the organization to innovate, and it's process-driven. It's high on strategic objectives that are shared and communicated. It's done with empathy, because what you want is hearts and minds engaged in a collaborative and a consensus approach, and it's commitment. The third type of organization, and it's much more about perception. You can see it in organization, but it's also, you can see it in people, the way that they think, the way that they behave, and you can have a combination. But in an organization, we're seeing more and more organizations where it's collaboration externally, and it's also collaboration internally. And this is a specific need for an HR business advocate with business acumen, where there's a multitude of organizational structures, both internally and externally, where you're working with suppliers, providers, customers, and at times your competitors. And what this organization requires is not just understanding that I understand the strategy, but I actually am committed in a behavioral change to improving my performance in this organization, because this organization has meaning for me and it adds value about what I'm doing. And we can see some examples in some of the companies that we're working with, particularly in things like medical devices, where you're working to offer the best. Somebody said, I'm proud to work for this organization because I know if my brother has a heart attack, he's going to get the best medical device that's in the world. And they are offering solutions. They work with hospitals, with manufacturers, suppliers, patients, and the community to make sure that their solutions are the best. And in the Middle East, we're also working with some regulatory authorities who are dealing with multinational companies who have lots more resources than they have in a vast marketplace. And they're also working with their suppliers, their customers, but it's much more in a collaborative framework than the first company that I described. So those are the challenges. If I could move to the next slide, Carolyn. The issue is, if in this massive change process, what's the mechanism that we as HR have to add value? And a lot of global reports are still saying we're still relying on happy sheets and spreadsheets to show our success. And I'm sure there are out there lots of solutions to all these issues, but the problem is they're often not widely shared. And internally, to deliver the sort of solutions that we're talking about, HR department needs to have the competence and confidence to take their position at the executive table. And the fundamental issue is, do we know, do we have the evidence to show that what we're doing has impact and adds value and is a critical component of the business strategy? Well, as I said, recent reports suggest that large amounts of the HR departments are still relying on spreadsheets and happy sheets to show their accomplishment. Okay, next slide please, Carolyn. Okay. If we got that opportunity to have impact and add value, then one of the key mechanisms that we've got is designing learning programs. One of the key issues is, does our learning intervention actually go to leading edge to hit business performance? And if it is, how are we presenting that evidence to our corporate colleagues to show that we're making that impact? And it goes beyond just anecdotal feedback into data. Some of us in the past, and I know I was part of this process as well, that the commissioning process is often based on content. So I can go to any one of the providers, I can get their magazines and their brochures, and I can pick a program that sounds pretty like the one that I want. And if it's delivered by somebody that I trust, then that's often the criteria. And when they come back from the program, there's anecdotal feedback that feeds that data, but it's not data. It's not things that I can use. And Carolyn and I have been in companies where we've said to supervisors and line managers, tell us how you know things are effective here. And they say, our supervisors tell us. It's that data that we're missing. And when we get into those programs that give us really good anecdotal feedback, we're into trainers who are comfortable delivering their content and also in the business of edutainment. They can educate, but they also entertain. And that fuels our business and our reliance on content. But underneath the content, the behaviors are the things that need to be applied. It's the context that's important. And the content and the context often aren't aligned. That brings me to the next slide, which is bridging the knowing-doing gap. We've often not gone into people development because we can't measure that impact. So the whole cycle of not having the data, relying on anecdotal feedback, breeds a cycle because we believe it's complex and it's too variable. And people now, when we started out with this, there were 850 variables. We've got it down to, after 15 years researched with Professor Ed Holton, we've got down to 6 variables. And underneath those variables are 6 fundamental gaps that need to be filled by a systematic assessment and evaluation process. The first one is, are we delivering the strategy in terms of the behaviors that are required at the workplace? Now, most organizations, the estimate in Europe is 70% of organizations now have competencies. The competencies are really useful. They get you down, some of them, into a behavioral mindset. The problem is translating those competencies into the deliverables in the specific work situation. Innovation in McDonald's isn't the same as innovation in Hewlett-Packard. So a competency on innovation has a number of assumptions about what innovation means in your context. And we've worked with some organizations. A car manufacturer was changing its strategy. They wanted to develop their innovation in people. We had a diagnostic that did it. And what they were doing was sheep dipping. They were putting large amounts of people through the same program. And when we found and went back to talk to the ones who were highly innovative, what they said is, what is innovation is production isn't necessarily the same as innovation in research and development. So the competencies are really useful at honing you down, but they're not specific enough to be applied to the actual situation and the behaviors in the workplace. The organization that I work with, Management Research Group, recently evaluated some of their competencies in terms of a very, very successful program. 32% of the people on that program improved their performance. 37% of the people regressed, went backwards. Now, that tells me you can run excellent programs, but underneath the programs, there's something going on that we need to keep hold of. One of that is the second gap, and that's the relevance gap. Business schools, if you want to do a business school program, it's probably the same content in Washington as it is in Harvard, as it is in London, as it is in Bangkok, as it is in Beijing, in particular areas. Now, the problem is applying a concept to my particular situation. And again, the ones that are really good at it end up as individual pioneers because they're trying to change an organization without really doing that thing that second slide said about the complexity and the completeness of requiring an approach which is integrated, systematic, and includes all the factors that are involved in the difference between learning and doing. The third gap is an alignment gap with the stakeholders. I've never yet once met a manager who's not interested in developing their people. Publicly, they will extol the virtue of developing people. But when you see them in the work situation, they often aren't doing it. And the problem isn't always negative. The problem is they often don't know how to do it, and the problem is the time and resources required. But alignment is a critical factor in the success. Finding a simple, systematic, and integrated way of showing a line manager how to, and then guiding them through the process is part of our system. In Saudi, I'm working in Saudi companies that are spending a lot of money after the kingdom's given young people the privilege of going away and experiencing PhDs, MBAs, master's degrees from around the world. And then they're putting him into the context of the culture in those companies. And the problem isn't the intellect and the knowledge, but actually line management commitment and alignment to enable that process to go on. Line management and the development of people is an essential alignment. The next one is a cultural gap. And culture is extremely strong, and culture eats strategy. Finding a way of changing people's behavior is so critical to changing culture. And in many cultures, there's a difference and an understanding that you don't challenge your boss. And in order to change that, it needs a lot of motivation, a lot of commitment, a lot of capability, and a lot of support. And often that isn't aligned. And it isn't just one person. It's how do we get the whole HR system, the whole line management aligned behind understanding what it takes to have impact and add value. The fifth one is the performance gap. Where you've got 360-degree appraisal, it's important to understand that people are flexible. In my experience of doing 360-degree feedback, you recognize that people can behave differently with managers, peers, direct reports, as well as their families. But we need to understand, and people need the awareness to understand, how their behavior impacts on different people in different contexts. And there may be a willful blindness about that understanding and performance process that often measurement systems at the moment don't have, because we're simply using spreadsheets or we're simply looking at time, quality, quantity. We've got to go beyond understanding people's capability, and that's why talent is becoming such an issue, and stock markets and stake shareholders are beginning to ask for more information about how to measure people's talent and performance that's bigger than just profit and has more meaning than just a financial tick box. The sixth factor is the way that we present our information in terms of the value that we add. And the language of business is critical. And showing how investment in people is impacting is important. Yet some of the measures that we use are about process, and it's easy to measure process in terms of time, speed, quantity, and quality. But it doesn't tell us whether people want to make a difference or have meaning in their work, in what they're doing. And that's where you get that true commitment, action, and behavioral change that adds value to the business. It's not just about adding value to the business, though. It's about adding value to people so that they have purpose and meaning in their lives. And how much more value will people have if they feel that they are truly contributing to the business? And it makes business sense as people will be more innovative, and more studies are consistently showing that people who have meaning and purpose in their work are aligned, and their values, and those are the ones that outperform those who don't. So let me take you through the gap fillers. At 3L Life Learning and MRG, we've developed a simple 4-stage process. Our first stage is to define where you want to be strategically and use that competence study, but underpinning it with what are the behaviors that are aligned in the context. Once we've defined where you want to be, we then describe using a 360 where you are now. And the gap between where you want to be and where you are now, we then design programs that fast-track the delivery to deliver those behaviors that you are wanting to develop in your context. Now, that process most companies will have. The issue is that we found that gap between designing and driving further the business. So, Carolyn, the next slide.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, something's happening. Hold on.
That it's the driving and embedding. It's the ability to measure that your programs are having impact, and it's the acceleration of those programs into performance, and then the added value of whether your programs are actually adding value. So this four-stage process, the third stage of designing, what we look for are the exemplars in an area, and we can help organizations define the exemplar behaviors in the behaviors that you want to develop. So we can define with you what the exemplars are doing when they're innovating in their context. And then we can replicate their behaviors to make sure that their programs are relevant and realistic for participants to go away and develop. When we've done that, we use a diagnostic, and our diagnostics then tell us whether the 16 variables that we've researched has been validated in 42 countries, in 24 countries, whether those 16 enablers are having impact. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Carolyn, and she's going to take you through the systematic process that we use.
And just before I go to the actual tool, what we're trying to move people through is like they would move through in any change curve. So people move generally through being aware of a situation that they need to change, to understanding, and then on to real behavioral change. What tends to happen in businesses and in companies is some companies really base everything on just reactive. I want to get it done. Others move through to then being standardized and consistent. You move into focused and you align with the business. And those that are really agile and able to react to different changing situations in the market become very strategic. That also follows through then that with individuals in those organizations, if you're in a reactive kind of culture or company, you're very crisis-driven, you're spreadsheet-based, you conform, you follow, you are compliant. If you're more engaged in the organization, and people are using those little self-service kind of answers, it's still very much hierarchical, still very much top-down. You can be engaged, but you don't often have a lot of meaning. Meaning comes when you're actually aligned and your values are very much aligned with what the business is. And if you want to get real commitment from your employees, then you need to be empowering them. Often this is in a more matrix kind of structure, and people are actually involved in anticipating things that are going on in the outside market and actually adapting and bringing the change within. So you have a much more innovative workforce than you would typically have in a very hierarchical structure. So that's kind of where you're aiming to be if you want to have innovation in your organization, if you want to have empowered employees, if you want to be competitive and actually make a difference to people's lives. As we said before, we've never met managers who weren't interested in developing their people. It's just a question of how and the time that they're given to actually do it. Our model is based on research, which is over 30 years of research now, from Professor Ed Holton, who's one of 5 experts in adult learning in the world. And what he looked at over about 15 years was what are the factors that are actually supporting learning transfer. following any kind of learning intervention. So it doesn't matter if it's a training program, if it's coaching, whatever it's focusing on. And as Mike said, he's done research in 24 countries in 12 different languages, and over 20,000 people now have been through the program. And what he found was he started off with many factors, over hundreds of factors, and he, through the research, pushed them down into 16 that are really making the difference. And these are the ones that we're now using within our tool. And those indicators are the ones that really do impact on changing behavior. So if somebody's been away to a training program, what they need to have when they come back to the job is the ability or the capability to actually be able to implement what they've learned. They need to have motivation, and the work environment really needs to support them in that. So those are the three categories, and in most of our experience we see that actually people are fairly capable. The training programs, the content is usually very good. There are sometimes some issues around transfer design, so people aren't always able to practice and don't always understand how they can apply the theory into their context. But generally transfer design is very good. Opportunity to use can be an issue in companies because they don't let people have that space and time, or the person may not already be in the position to be able to use it. And their personal capacity is generally very good. I think in everything we've done, we've rarely seen low motivation. People are usually highly motivated after a really good experience to come back and make some changes. What we do find, though, is that in the work environment, there are often many barriers which are just preventing people being able to do what they've learnt. And that's where you go into, again, the pioneer who comes back trying to change many things on his own or her own, and are not supported nor encouraged by the organisation to actually make the change. Just move down to the next. When we run our diagnostic tool, which is called the LTSI, this is basically what a report looks like. And from any group, we will be able to very quickly, it's a 52-question questionnaire that they fill in about a week after the training program. So they would have had time to come back to the office after being on the training program and start to think about how they're going to apply their learning. This is a report based on those questions, and it's been validated, as I said. And we can quickly see that content validity in this particular report is very good. People are, very positive about the learning experience, but there are some issues in transfer design, in the motivation to transfer, and there don't seem to be very many positive outcomes for them actually to change their behaviour. Mike, did you want to say any more about this one?
No, I'll let you go.
Okay, so in this company, actually, the content validity was very high. So the program was actually a really good program, very good trainer. Theory was great. Very enthusiastic people returned. The issue was it was a leadership program for leaders who were not actually leading any teams at the time. So it was a leadership program that high potentials were following for when they would be a future leader. Now the issue with that is when you actually become a leader later on, you would have forgotten what you've learned in the training, because if you don't practice within the first 6 weeks of getting back onto the job, there's a very high chance that you're not actually going to implement your learning. So for the organisation investing in this training, it ends up being quite a lot of money that's wasted, or money that is not wasted from the individual perspective, because the individual will learn something, but from the organisational perspective, there's very little impact on business results. And this is part of the problem in the research that Professor Ed Holton did, was that he found that $60 billion was being spent in the US. If you count up all the costs around the training as well, it was ending up at something like $400 billion. And if you think about worldwide how much money we're spending on training, and only 10 to 30% is ever transferred, then there is a lot of money being wasted in getting more effective performance in organizations.
Yeah, can I just add there, Carolyn? That
Sure, yeah.
One of the issues with a global humanitarian company that was doing a leadership program, the program was being validated by Harvard. When we did the LTSI on them, we found content validity and transfer design was absolutely superb, scoring at the levels that you see at the moment. The problem then was they were trying to invest more money into the design and development of an even better program, when actually the work situation was all red.
Yeah, and actually, just from this very simple questionnaire that we did with them, they were able to actually find out that there were quite a lot of issues within a change program that was going through the organization that had very little to do with the actual training program. So through the results that we're getting, and as we're uncovering what is causing these results, you actually find out something much larger in the bigger system of the organization that's happening. So it's not always just to do with the program either. So there's a lot of unintended consequences come out of the questioning of the results quite often. And it comes out very quickly.
And it's like a knife. It tells HR with data where they need to focus, and often we've had HR managers come up thanking us for giving them the data because they've been arguing for the last 5 years that line management or their directors or somebody else needs to be doing this, not just designing a really good training program.
And this second report, you can see that the content validity is very high, transfer design was very good, which means people know how to translate the program into what they're going to use in their context, how they're going to use it, what they're going to change. Motivation to transfer very high, personal self-efficacy very high. But the issue with this group of people was their management support is very low. So when they got back onto the actual job, they were getting little or no support from their manager. And at the same time, when we've spoken to training departments who've been running the programs and we're asking them, what is the feedback from your line managers? They'll say, oh, we're really happy with the program. Now, being happy with a program and being happy with the person coming back does not mean that you're actually supporting the change. And this is often the case, and we see that time and time again.
And the other thing, Carolyn, in that is that it identifies the responsibility of each of the stakeholders in the learning cycle. So you get HR being able to champion the change because they know specifically what they're asking each one of the stakeholders to do.
Yeah, I'm very aware of time, so I'm just going to go very quickly through this next one. Basically, the LTSI, if you look to the bottom of that graph, it's the transfer diagnosis. So that is the 16 barriers or enablers to learning transfer. But that is set in a full cycle. So we have a number of tools all the way around the cycle, starting from a needs analysis and looking at the gap of where your behavior is currently in your job and where you think the role should be. Also looking at it from your manager's perspective, and first of all, actually even linking your particular, what you need to deliver to the business, to the actual business strategy. So we do a lot of work up front on that. Then we go into the needs assessment, behavioral objectives, performance pretest is a pretest on the behaviors you're actually going to train in your training program. Transfer contract is contracting that's done with the participant and your manager before going on the program. Then you have your training intervention, the LTSI, an action plan for learning transfer, so not an action plan on content. Then we have a transfer follow-up where we look and have an ongoing automatic reply from people about how they're actually able to implement their learning transfer and what's happening. So very qualitative feedback on what is really happening. And then a post-test about 6 months later to see, okay, is there a difference in the behavior pre-program and post-program? And then there's a final ROI model, which then will just give you a rating on on what your ROI has actually been on that program. And we're seeing very high ROIs on most of the things we're doing, especially in leadership. Because, of course, if you're changing behavior of a leader just even a little bit, then they have quite a large impact on the organization.
The key to that is, Carolyn, it's just, if you go back to the cycle.
Don't know how to go back, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Here we go.
Yeah. Right. That cycle, the LTSI, the Learning Transfer System, diagnoses where there are gaps in that learning cycle. So if you've got a behavioral problem, it's the needs assessment. If you've got an alignment problem, it's usually the transfer contract. Those modules take 10 minutes. So any line manager, part of this system, can't argue that he can't develop his people. It's 10 minutes per module, it's timed, and it tells them exactly what to do. This is, I think probably the best bet is to put it to the audience, and then we'll conclude if we've got time with the slides to follow.
Yeah, okay. So I'll put it back here. So, yeah. Ali, were there any questions?
Well, yeah, I've seen there's one question already popped up. So we have reached to the conclusion. I mean, so we can start the Q&A section.
Yeah, we'll start the Q&A and we'll come back to the conclusion if we have time, because we're very conscious that we've taken a bit of time there.
Yeah. Okay, there's one question from Mr. Paul Greasley. The question is, thank you for a most thought-provoking presentation. What is the best way to align personal motivation to succeed with the organizational mandate to make a difference in the marketplace?
Shall I answer that one?
Yeah.
There's a difference between motivation and motivation at work. All the stuff that's coming out on self-directed learning and empowered learning suggests certain characteristics like self-efficacy and resilience, and they also apply to learning at work. But there are, in the research, we found 4 key motivational characteristics that are essential at the workplace. The first one is that somebody is open to the learning, that they are given all the information, they understand the implications of what they're being asked to do, and they can relate that learning to their context. So openness is a key characteristic. The second one is conscientiousness in delivery, that they systematically have a plan and that they regularly review their plan and they set systematic goals. And you can see some of the overlap now with the motivation generally and the motivation to learn. The third one is that the locus of control. They believe that they have some capability of changing their work environment and having impact on their work environment. The final one is the interesting one, and that's where they have meaning and they can make a difference and an impact in their work. So there's a lot of research that we've done on motivation at work. It overlaps with some of the issues on motivation of people in general, but it is specific to work environment. What we're doing is developing an app that not only puts groups in charge, because the LTSI is based on a group, but can actually begin to start linking with the motivation of the person and make them empowered achievers. So they're not individual pioneers. They understand their motivation, they can relate it to the LTSI, they are then given stuff on the motivation at learning with those 4 characteristics, and then they can become an empowered learner. And it doesn't matter what situation you're placing them in, they can drive through their empowered achiever.
And underneath all of that is resilience.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
No, it's fine.
Because if what we're seeing is more and more organizations, or I've been discussing with one organization in particular, who actually, they spent 2 years just making their workforce more resilient, because they're finding if you can increase the resilience and have that in individuals' behaviour, they can actually then drive through a lot more change in the organisation.
Well, thank you very much. So you want me to proceed with another question we have already popped up, or should we wait till you?
Please.
Okay, we have another one from Mr. John Kakusis. The question is motivation enough by itself, or should we first make sure trust is developed between the team before one can achieve better and faster results?
Brilliant question, John. The first thing is, with a relationship, you can do anything. Without a relationship, you can't do anything. That trust is the fundamental foundation for any learning. If there isn't trust there, you don't get learning, or you get a consequence that may not be about where you want to be and where they want to be. I think what we're also saying, we're doing a lot of work in the financial sector, and those guys, the organization that we're working there, I had a conversation with the HR director, and he said, you know, Mike, we have 3,000 people worldwide looking for the most talented people, and when we get them into the organization, they're really rewarded with large amounts of money for what they're doing. He said, you know the one thing that we don't do? He says, that's engage them. And the engagement, they've just had a large amount of discount. They were fined by the Financial Services Authority, and they've just had a large amount of money back from when they showed their engagement figures. Now, engagement and motivation are good, but it's no indication of a behavioral change. And I don't know any of the professions at the moment that aren't interested in getting a behavioral change. But it is a matter not just of one individual being motivated. When we did the LTSI on those bankers, they were highly motivated, but they were their behavioral change.
Behaving very well.
I had to bite my tongue on that one. And it's that. You can get the motivation, people can get the motivation, but unless you've got that alignment, and I agree with you totally, trust is an essential part of getting that environment, and creating that trust, I think, is a pretty big responsibility for the organization, the line management, the individual, everybody. And one of the other things, John, coaching, you can see coaching in there, of the research that's coming out, just looking at coaching, and you get a 32% increase in the impact of your learning. So yes, trust is important. Over to you, Ellie.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another a couple of short ones. Why did you decide to do what you are doing?
That was the road to Damascus experience of beginning to sit down and question why we were doing what we were doing. And it was that whilst we were having fun edutaining people, we were good at taking learning and making it entertaining, and our happy sheets were recording 92% satisfaction in terms of content. But it wasn't actually helping, and it wasn't doing things that were actually having impact. And how much more impact you can have now when you know that if you can assess whether people are having the impact, which is the purpose of the training anyway. People, it's not just about having a holiday or being away from work for 3 days, but which, by the way, some people argue it is. They'll sit in your training room and they'll, for the first half day, you're trying to convince them why they're there. But actually making a difference and making sure that people become empowered achievers and take not only responsibility, but actually can make a difference in their world is what we're doing. Carolyn?
It's also from the organizational perspective. Ultimately, it was the organization who was our client. So they were paying us to come in and train leaders or whoever it was through a process to actually deliver better results. And it was really arguable what those better results were. First of all, it was very difficult to measure them. Many organizations 15 years ago went through large ROI practices, and they spent so much money on the process. And in the end, because there were so many different factors hitting the individual, it's very difficult to say exactly where it's coming from. So when we saw this, it was a much simpler way of doing it, just to get that basic data back, which you can actually use and continue to use as almost a kind of a quality improvement process. And that's what it does really over time, because you can measure different groups, you can have different departments or roles, and even with the same training program, you can see patterns of how things are happening very differently in different areas, depending on the leaders or whatever. And for us, I think it was actually, this is interesting because it's much more looking at the system rather than just at the individual. And if we're going to get change and we need to speed change up, then we need to be working with the system, not just the individual level.
And that's a key characteristic with the diagram that's in front of people. If you use the learning transfer, the transfer diagnosis at 6, then what you've got to do is you can come back to any one of those 10 modules and start the process again. If you start with a good process that most companies will do with a needs analysis, we can do that in a day with a group of people. But once you've done that, stage 2, 3, and 4, you're going through a quality improvement process. So the needs assessment is, are you strategically aligned? Do people understand the behaviors? Can you apply those behaviors? And do you think they're important? Once you begin to ask questions like that, you've got the key alignment issues resolved. You then go to the behavioral objectives that are beginning to talk in the context, can you apply these behaviors in your context? You go to a pre-test, which is just 360 degrees, or your performance test, and then you've got the transfer contract. But you're beginning to build a quality improvement. Rather than evaluate the end of a program and see if it adds value, we've got a process that actually is quality improvement right from the very beginning and gives you a return on investment calculation.
Yeah, because we do this in the very beginning. Previously, when I was doing training needs assessment, before, it would take 3 months. You'd have 3 months of interviews. Now we're doing it in a day. But it also tightens up the design. So any training program you're designing for what that role actually needs to deliver for the business. It's not let's add coaching in because we think our leaders should be able to coach. It's actually, why do they need to coach? What is it that they're adding to their teams, to the business, that means that we need to do coaching here? And if it makes business sense, then you add it in. But your design is much tighter. You can already see, you can already cluster groups of people together who have the same capability gap instead of just doing one training program for everybody. And it's also pushing trainers to not just deliver what they're comfortable in delivering, which is what often happens. You come and say, oh, I know how to do this very well, so I'll put together a leadership program which has got leadership pipeline and coaching and this and that. It actually pushes them to say, well, actually, we need this capability because our business is going in this direction now. So can you train something that will actually help them with achieving that behavioral change? So it pushes the focus much more on tight design as well, and having the right people in the group who need that kind of content. So you cluster groups differently as well. So it moves away from the blanket training of one size fits all.
Okay.
One last question.
Yes, we have another. How does this methodology apply to changing world in the Middle East?
It's no different from any other nation apart from specific issues. I'm working in Saudi Arabia at the moment on assignments on leadership development and one organizational restructuring. And the issues that we've talked about are exactly the same. It's defining the behaviors and being clear strategically. What are the behaviors you want to develop? Then it's a matter of designing the program that actually gives practice to those behaviors. The big area is getting alignment in the organization, because there's a lot of issues around changing the existing culture. The thing I said about power distance, when I was at doing my PhD at Leeds, I'm not going into that, but there are issues around power distance that often makes it difficult in the Middle East to get the data to actually begin to start looking at the areas you want to focus in on to get that alignment. And those are particular to the Middle East. And if you've got the behavior designed, if you've got the performance test right, the transfer contract is an important part. But then the training and the transfer diagnostic focuses you in. I've worked with 5 or 6 Saudi organizations, and they've really benefited from having the focus on what is having impact and the 16 enablers. Once we've got that data, the HR department has been able to go back, present to the chairman and chief executive what they need to do their job more effectively. Because sometimes there's a credibility gap with HR, and their conversations aren't data-driven, they're anecdotal-driven. And having the data to go back and challenge, this is what we need, this is what the validated 16 tools say, and we need the capability of going in with the resources to tackle these issues, has a significant impact on the conversation with HR at the executive level. And once you do that, the action plans then and the transfer follow-up is much, much easier. But it enables you to have those difficult conversations that HR sometimes can't have because it either hasn't the credibility or in some cases doesn't have the competence to deliver it. But
and I think the other thing is the speeding up. It actually speeds up, and at a time where you're reskilling a lot of people or trying to build, with the Saudiization, it's trying to build those skills very quickly in a local population. It speeds a lot of that up.
We can give you evidence of a behavioral change within 6 months, and that includes 3 months of practice. And going back to one of those slides right in the beginning, the chief executive can be reassured that the business strategy is being implemented because the data is showing you that people are changing their behavior. Do we want to go to conclusion?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. The key issue with that knowing-doing gap is going beyond leading-edge interventions that we have at the moment that are good on design and good on describing, but actually hit business performance and having the data to do that. It accelerates the actual impact of learning programs on the business performance. And we can tell you within 6 months whether your business strategy is being implemented. It gets people aligned. And if they're not aligned, it gives them responsibility and accountability for increasing their performance, but aligns those stakeholders and puts a clear focus and a light on where you want development. And when you saw that diagram on the LTSI, it had reds, greens, blues, but it also gives you an indicator of best world practice to measure yourself by. It assesses the adhesion of existing learning programs and makes sure they stick through with their changes, because a lot of them are content-driven and education-driven. Next, Carolyn. We can evaluate what creates and accelerates learning-driven performance. And I think that's, if not unique, it's integrated, it's systematic. Lots of people are doing stage 1, 2, and 3, the training needs analysis, the learning contract. Very few of them have integrated it with the action plan or with the pre-post and the return on investment calculation. I think the crux of it is the learning transfer system is 16 people performance indicators. That for the first time your chief executives have 16 key performance indicators because 65% of them don't have the data